With the Phoenix Suns losing in the second round of the playoffs to the Dallas Mavericks in a series where everyone was certain they would win, most of the blame went to Chris Paul, who played absolutely atrocious after the first two games of the series, playing some of the worst basketball of his career. And as you probably heard, Patrick Beverley came out and said that Chris Paul was overrated, wasn't as good as people thought, and he just said he was just not that good. And that brings up the question of whether or not what Patrick Beverley was saying was somewhat true. Obviously, not everything he said was true. Like, Chris Paul is not a walking cone on defense. But regardless, in today's video, I'm going to be answering whether or not I think Chris Paul is underrated or overrated. First, I'm going to make a case for him being underrated, then I'll make a case for him being overrated. Then at the end of the video, I'm going to come to a conclusion on which side I think he's on. But before we get into the video, I ask you to drop a like on this video as it does help my channel grow. Subscribe to my channel if you want daily NBA content. Also, if you want us to go over 3,000 subscribers. Also, drop a comment on this video as I do respond to all of my comments, and play that intro. Make the case that Chris Paul is underrated. First of all, he's a 12-time All-Star, 10-time All-NBA, 9-time All-Defensive Team player. He's one of the most accomplished point guards in league history, one of the best passers in history. A lot of people consider him to be the best pure point guard in league history, but that's not the case for Chris Paul being underrated, because even if you think Chris Paul is overrated, you still have to acknowledge he's one of the best point guards in league's history. But the reason Chris Paul may be underrated is due to the fact that people tend to undermine him as a player, as people just believe he's a choker, guy who never performs in the playoffs, and I just simply don't think that's the case, because I think it's just more of the fact that Chris Paul is generally the most unlucky player in NBA history. When you look at his playoff stats for his career overall, he averages 20 points and 8 assists, shooting more efficiently than he does in the regular season. He literally becomes a better scorer and a more efficient scorer in the playoffs while still being an elite facilitator with barely any turnovers. I really don't understand how people could say he's just a flat out choker. A lot of people like to act like he turns into some average point guard in the playoffs, and simply that's not the case. I'm aware that in plenty of big playoff games he kind of disappears and shrinks, but people ignore the playoff games where his team is on the line and Chris Paul steps up. For example, in the 2015 first round, this was back when Chris Paul was on the Clippers. They were facing the defending champion San Antonio Spurs. It was game 7. It was clear that Chris Paul was dealing with a hamstring injury, yet he still went out there and balled, having 27 points on 69% shooting while hitting the game winner over two of the Spurs' best defenders in Danny Green and Tim Duncan. This was a big series for the Clippers. I could bring up a lot of other moments like that. But simply, people are acting like Chris Paul is just some terrible playoff performer, and I'm not going to say he's an amazing playoff performer, an all-time great playoff performer like a Michael Jordan, LeBron James, but for the most part, he's very good in the playoffs and he does step up in the playoffs. Chris Paul is also just one of the most impactful point guards in the league's history, and I'm not just talking about how he's a great passer, he gets his teammates involved. He's a franchise-changing player, and there's rarely guys like that. We saw what he did with the Clippers. The Clippers were a terrible team, and people were considering kicking them out of Los Angeles. They went from a team, they still didn't win a championship with Chris Paul, but they were always in the talks to win one. They were never that before him. Then when he went to the Houston Rockets, they were a team that could actually compete with the Golden State Warriors with Kevin Durant. No other team in that era was able to do that. Then when he was traded to the Thunder, before the season started, people thought they were going to be competing for the #1 pick, but they were actually competing to get a top 3 seed in the conference, and they had a very competitive first round series with the Houston Rockets. Then when he got traded to Phoenix, now he went from a team that didn't make the playoffs, like the Suns didn't make the playoffs for a decade, and then the very same year that he joined them, they made the NBA Finals, and then this year they had the best record in the league. Not a lot of point guards in NBA history can do that, and I feel like a lot of people don't realize that. Sure, he hasn't won a championship, but Chris Paul is a winning player. Just because he has no championships does not mean he's a winning player. But yeah, that's the case for Chris Paul being underrated. To make the case for Chris Paul being overrated, pretty much is the fact that he's a great player in the regular season, but when there's real pressure, how good does he become? And that's a valid concern because there are multiple showings of him choking. For example, in Game 5 in the 2014 second round, the Clippers were facing the Thunder. This was a very important series. The series was tied at 2 games apiece. The Clippers were firmly in control of the game. With 4 minutes left, the Clippers were by 13 points. With 49 seconds left, the Clippers were by 7 points after a clutch jump shot from Chris Paul. But at the end of the game, Chris Paul had 2 humongous turnovers that led to OKC points and committed a very dumb but controversial call on Russell Westbrook that helped OKC steal the game. That is by far the biggest example of Chris Paul choke in my opinion. For being honest, it was unacceptable. And then in the 2015 conference semifinals, he blew a 3-1 lead. A lot of people like to blame him for that, but to be honest, he didn't play that bad in the series at all. He was still a guy who was considered one of the best point guards in the league though, so you might make the argument that no matter how good you play, you still just have to not blow a 3-1 lead, especially when you have the better team. I'm not saying that's what I believe, I'm just saying some people definitely believe that. But there's also people who believe Chris Paul just gets way too much excuses. He's always disappearing and he's always getting injured whenever it's time for him to step up. And they think he's just a protected player who never gets any slander or anything. A lot of people think he's viewed as just some goody two-shoes player who can't do anything wrong, when that's far from the truth. And people simply think he needs to be held up to the high standards of being a top 10 point guard in NBA history. And they don't feel like he's actually held up to those standards. People compare him to average players. That's my case for Chris Paul being overrated. But to answer the question of whether or not I think Chris Paul's career is underrated or overrated, honestly, I understand both sides. I don't think he's a terrible playoff performer, but I do think he gets a lot of passes just because he's Chris Paul. And people view him as a perfect player when he's far from that. And I think he's just a little bit, and I mean a little bit overrated, very, very little. Trust me, I'm not a Chris Paul hater at all. He's a guy who I enjoy to watch, but if we're being honest, people act like he's some point guard. He is a point guard, but if he was really a point guard, he would come up clutch most times. And simply when the game is on the line, it's a game 7 or a very critical game, he more times than not does not show up. But overall, in the playoff series, he'll show up. He'll show up through game 1 to 4, but then last 2-3 games of the series, he might disappear. But I honestly could also see an argument for being underrated because not enough people see how much value he has, period. But yeah, I think Chris Paul's a little bit overrated, but still a great player. And I have him at the 5th best point guard in league history, but he's not over Russell Westbrook. Anyways, guys, that's it for the video. Let me know whether or not you think Chris Paul is overrated or underrated. Drop a like on this video to help my channel grow. Subscribe to my channel if you want daily NBA content. Also, if you want to go over 3,000 subscribers, also drop a comment on this video. I do respond to all of my comments. And play that intro.